Welcome back to the Path to Happiness and Introduction to the Unification Principle. I'm your host, Dr. Tyler Hendricks. Now, let us examine the First World War. World War I broke out in 1914 and ended in 1918. The Allied powers stood under the banner of Christian democracy in support of religious freedom. Thus, they stood on God's side. On the other hand, the Central Powers suppressed freedom of religion and even suppressed Christianity. Therefore, they stood on Satan's side. What were the providential causes behind the First World War? The First World War took place, first, to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition to restore God's three blessings at the formation stage. Second, the First World War took place in order to have people on God's side collectively overcome Jesus' first temptation on the world level. By prevailing in his first temptation in the wilderness, Jesus recovered himself, symbolized by the rock, and laid the foundation to restore perfection of individual character. Likewise, by prevailing in the First World War, God's side was to build God's world and lay the foundation for its new center, Christ, at the second coming. This victory was the basis upon which the returning Christ could be born and perfect his individual character. Third, the First World War took place in order to lay the formation stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. In the First World War, God's side was responsible to be victorious and expand its political territory to bring true Christian democracy and religious freedom to the world. By thus establishing this political and economic foundation, it would secure the formation stage foundation for the democratic world and, at the same time, the formation stage foundation to restore God's sovereignty. The victory of the Allied powers in the First World War fulfilled the formation stage indemnity condition to restore God's first blessing worldwide. By overcoming Satan's first temptation to Christ to turn stones into bread on the worldwide level, the foundation for the birth of the returning Christ, who is destined to be the Lord of God's world, was laid. With heaven's victory in World War I, the League of Nations was established, and the defeated nations of World War I liberated their colonies. Christian missions expanded, Christians established global interfaith outreach, and strove to unite among themselves. In the Second World War, democracy, while standing upon the formation stage victory attained in the First World War, defeated fascism, and the second victory at the growth stage. Fascism denies the fundamental values of modern democracy, including respect for the individual and our basic rights, freedom of religion, speech, the press, and association, and representative government. Individuals and institutions exist only for the benefit of the state. Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and the leaders of Japan's militaristic government were racist dictators of the fascist type. In the Second World War, an alliance of the democratic nations, the United States, Great Britain, and France, led the nations on God's side. Satan's side was the alliance of fascist nations, Germany, Japan, and Italy. World War II broke out in 1939. The Allies stood on God's side because they supported Christianity and religious freedom. Their political systems were democracies, the political system for the final stage of the providence of restoration, founded upon the Abel type view of life. The Axis powers stood on Satan's side because they persecuted Christianity, denied religious freedom, and were murderously racist. Fascism is National Socialism, which is anti-democratic and based on the Keynes-type view of life. What were the internal providential causes behind the Second World War? First, the war broke out to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the growth stage to restore God's three blessings. The second providential cause behind the Second World War, was to have the people on God's side overcome Jesus' second temptation on the world level. In light of the meaning of Jesus' three temptations, we can recognize that God's side had to prevail in the Second World War to fulfill the indemnity conditions to restore worldwide God's second blessing. The third providential cause behind the war was to lay the growth stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. As Jesus laid the foundation for the restoration of children by overcoming the second temptation in the wilderness, God's side was to lay the worldwide growth stage foundation for democracy by triumphing in the Second World War. Finally, by laying the growth stage foundation for the democratic world, it established the growth stage foundation to restore God's sovereignty. The United Nations was formed, and this time the victorious nations voluntarily liberated their colonies. Now, we talked about the three world wars. How do we see the Third World War taking place? At the consummation of human history, Satan's side and God's side will both advance until they each attain sovereignty over a world. This is why the democratic world and the communist world stand confronting each other. Consequently, it is inevitable that there be a final struggle, first to divide and then to unite these two worlds. The First and Second World Wars divided the globe into communist and democratic worlds. Afterward, yet another war must take place to bring about their harmonization, for ultimately Hellenism and Hebraism represent the external and internal ideals for which all of humanity longs and which God created. This struggle is the Third World War. There are two ways it is being fought. One way is through armed conflict. The other way is as an internal ideological conflict, without the outbreak of armed hostilities, to bring the two worlds into unification. Whether the Third World War is ended by force of arms or as an ideological conflict depends upon the responsibility of the people who are serving the providence of God. Regardless, it is inevitable that this worldwide conflict take place. What are the internal providential causes behind the Third World War? First, the war has to take place to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the completion stage to restore God's three great blessings. Second, the Third World War has to take place to have the people on God's side overcome Jesus' third temptation on the world level. As Jesus established the foundation to restore dominion over the creation by overcoming the third temptation in the wilderness, God must prevail in the Third World War to restore human beings' dominion over the entire universe. Third, the Third World War has to take place to lay the completion stage providence for the restoration of God's sovereignty. God's side must be victorious to overturn the communist world, restore religious freedom and the natural family, and return all sovereignty to God. Then the ideal world will be established based upon the principles of heaven and earth. In the beginning and middle phases of the Third World War, we saw the battle of arms and ideology between the Soviet Union, leader of the communist camp, and the free world, centering on the United States. With the demise of the Soviet Union, the structure of world communism ended along with the 20th century. However, the philosophies and values of that atheistic, materialistic worldview have not perished. The West believed that a new world order, a world of peace, would emerge after the fall of the Soviet Union. We believed that all problems would be solved once communist regimes were gone. Nonetheless, we now face even deeper questions concerning our existence. What is our nature and destiny? Are we merely products of materialistic evolution? Or are we servants of God? Or are we children of God? Or is human identity as male and female a transcendent reality? Or something just created by social norms? Have you arrived at an answer? An Abel-type view of life will arise and answer all the questions of the Cain-type view of life that have developed throughout history. Atheism, racism, materialism, consumerism, the misuse of love, drug abuse, criminality, homosexualism, and so forth. The Messiah is the one who is to bring this new expression of truth, which unites as it transcends the right and left, Abel and Cain viewpoints. The new truth will empower us to establish an ideal world where God's ideal of creation is fulfilled. This world will be a worldwide family centered on God, a world of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values founded in God. This world is one family under God, a world that blossoms and bears fruit of the culture of heart, a world that is governed not by judges and attorneys, but by God's love and truth. The last stage of the Third World War is a matter of culture and the ideas that shape it. We have to plant the view of life that every person is God's child, and that the way of God is to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. Why are young people today in such a crisis, with a decline of interest in marriage and family, departure from traditional faiths, increased drug use and dependency upon government and technology to solve everything? This is because of the absence of a spiritual movement that teaches and practices the true way of life. The older generation has to unite based on a life of true values and meaning, and show the younger generation how we live such lives. We have to become true parents, true spouses, and raise our families, communities, and societies to be true children and true brothers and sisters. The battles we are facing today around the world are with the powers of fear, hatred, and ignorance that call upon coercion, whether by statist authority or the barrel of a gun. We must absolutely win this war of ideas and culture by practicing the living Word of God. The Lord of the Second Advent will show us the truth and spirit to win this war. Therefore, we can have hope. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to sharing our insights into the Second Advent with you.